Do you hear me?
And I'm
Speak
going
the
with
fuck
him.
up, Reggie.
And if I'm there, you know what it's gonna be? Chitty, chitty, bang, bang, nigga. Gonna be.
Marcus! Oh, Reggie, baby,
No surviving document from the Detroit Pistons organization, no league office memo, and no contemporary newspaper archive records a formal, written rule barring players from speaking to reporters. The team never announced a media boycott. No league memo from that period cites a fine for violating one, and no player from the roster has described such a formal policy in the decades of interviews given since. What the record does show is a team that treated the press as openly as it treated an opposing offense, refusing to explain its physical style, refusing to apologize for hard fouls, and building a reputation for terse, guarded answers that made national writers dread the locker room, even without a written policy forcing that behavior. The Detroit Pistons of the late 1980s earned the nickname Bad Boys through their style of play as much as their record. Bill Laimbeer, Rick Mahorn, Dennis Rodman, Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Vinnie Johnson, and John Sally built a defense around physical contact and hard fouls, a style national media coverage regularly framed as dirty rather than tactically sound. That framing intensified through the team's playoff runs against the Boston Celtics and later the Chicago Bulls. Teams built around players the league had a clear commercial interest in protecting. The 1988 NBA Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers gave the team its first real national stage, and it produced one of Isaiah Thomas's most famous individual performances. At the same time, it hardened the press narrative against Detroit. Thomas severely sprained his ankle during Game 6 at the Great Western Forum and returned to the floor anyway, scoring 25 points in the third quarter alone on a leg he could barely plant on.
Fast forward to the fourth quarter, also known as Isaiah time.
Thomas pulls from deep, and it's the fourth quarter looking
10 points a game in the fourth quarter.
Detroit still lost that game and the series in 7, and the coverage that followed spent more time on the Pistons' physical fouls throughout the series than on Thomas's performance through visible pain, a pattern the players noticed and increasingly resented as the franchise kept winning.
Legitimate league MVP candidate.
Chuck Daly's staff developed what became known as the Jordan Rules ahead of the 1988 playoff matchup with Chicago, a defensive scheme built around forcing Jordan into contact, sending help from specific angles, and denying him the clean driving lanes he used against less physical defenses. The Pistons did not publish the details of that scheme for reporters. Players answered questions about it vaguely, describing only that they intended to make Jordan work for every basket, while the actual rotation stayed something opponents had to learn on film rather than in a press conference. Detroit beat Chicago in the Eastern Conference Finals in both 1989 and 1990 while running that same defense, each time declining to explain the mechanics in any real detail to the reporters covering the series. Laimbeer, in particular, built a personal reputation for combative media relations that outlasted his playing career. He answered questions with sarcasm, disputed the premise of hard questions on the record, and rarely offered the press the kind of quote that made a clean headline. Reporters covering the team through the championship seasons of 1989 and 1990 described a locker room that was accessible in the technical sense, in that the doors opened and players stood at their lockers, but unhelpful in practice because getting a usable answer out of Laimbeer or several of his teammates took real work. The team's most infamous moment involving the press and public perception together came at the end of Game 4 of the 1991 Eastern Conference Finals. Detroit trailed the Chicago Bulls in a series Chicago would go on to sweep 4-0, ending Detroit's run as back-to-back champions. As the final seconds ticked off the clock, Isaiah Thomas, lame beer, and several teammates walked off the court and toward the locker room before the game had officially ended, passing the Bulls bench without stopping to shake hands. Television cameras captured the walk clearly, and the moment became one of the most replayed images of poor sportsmanship in NBA history, cited for decades afterward as evidence of exactly the villain reputation the national press had already built around the team. Isaiah Thomas addressed the criticism surrounding the team's image directly in interviews conducted years after his playing career ended, arguing that the national media applied a double standard to Detroit that it never applied to teams built around more marketable stars. He pointed specifically to the contrast between how commentators described Detroit's physical defense and how they described similar physicality from other contenders, framing the villain narrative as a commercial choice by broadcasters rather than an honest read of how the team actually played. Those later comments are on the record and widely available, unlike any specific formal media policy from 1989 or 1990, which remains something no contemporary report or league document actually confirms existed. What the team did have, consistently, was a working relationship with the press defined by suspicion rather than cooperation. Reporters who covered the Pistons through their championship years have described an organization that gave the minimum required access under league rules, and rarely more, an approach that functioned as an unwritten policy, even without a locker room meeting where anyone formally proposed it. The distinction matters. A team can make itself difficult to cover through hundreds of small daily choices.
With the 60th pick in the 2011 NBA, the Sacramento Kings select Isaiah.
Brief answers, guarded body language, no unscripted moments, without ever holding a vote on a formal blackout. The Pistons won back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990 while operating under exactly that unofficial posture, sweeping the Los Angeles Lakers in the 1989 finals and beating the Portland Trail Blazers in 5 games in 1990. Neither championship required the team to soften its relationship with the press or explain its tactics in greater detail. Winning was the only answer the organization consistently offered to questions about how it played the game, and for 2 seasons that answer proved to be enough. The villain framing itself carried commercial value the league never fully disowned, even while it criticized the team's conduct. A clear antagonist made the Lakers and the Celtics, and later Jordan's Bulls, easier stories to sell, and Detroit's willingness to play that role without softening its image for the cameras gave broadcasters a rivalry with genuine tension rather than a manufactured one. The Pistons rarely tried to correct that framing in real time.
Clear out the lanes so that the great players, the great athletes could drive. That was geared more to help.
Doing so would have required exactly the kind of open, cooperative relationship with reporters the roster had already decided was not worth the effort, given how little the coverage had shifted in their favor, even during the seasons they were winning championships. The league's relationship with player media access changed substantially in the decades that followed, driven primarily by broadcast economics rather than any specific reaction to Detroit's conduct. Multi-billion-dollar television contracts now come with contractual obligations for player and coach availability, and the modern collective bargaining agreement requires participation in interviews and promotional appearances that did not exist in the same form during the Bad Boys era. A team choosing today to give reporters only guarded, minimal answers would still be operating within the rules, provided the access itself was not formally denied. What has genuinely closed is the option of an entire locker room disappearing from national coverage the way Detroit effectively did for 2 championship runs, not because a rule against it exists now that did not exist then, but because the league's television partnerships depend on a level of player visibility the sport did not require in 1989. The Jordan rules themselves became public knowledge in far greater detail than the Pistons ever volunteered, but not through the team's own cooperation.
Good. The man was an ex-coach. How do you stop Michael Jordan?
There's not much you can do with him. You have to make him go east to west. He's good.
Chicago Tribune reporter Sam Smith published a book in 1991 titled The Jordan Rules, built largely on access to the Bulls' side of the rivalry rather than Detroit's, and it remained one of the more detailed accounts available for years of exactly what Chicago's players believed Detroit was doing to them defensively. The team most responsible for the strategy stayed the hardest team to get that strategy from directly, even after it had already retired as a defending champion. That same dynamic resurfaced decades later when the 2020 documentary series The Last Dance revisited the Bulls' championship years, and by extension the Pistons' role as their chief early obstacle. The series gave modern audiences their most detailed look yet at how the Jordan rules functioned on film, largely through Chicago's own archival footage and the recollections of Bulls players and staff. Detroit's side of that history remained comparatively thin by comparison, the same imbalance in access that had defined the coverage of the team 3 decades earlier. The Bad Boys did not need a signed pact to make themselves the league's most difficult team to cover. Isaiah Thomas, Bill Laimbeer, and their teammates built that reputation the same way they built their defense, through hundreds of individual choices that added up to a wall the press could see but never fully get past, and 2 championship banners that made the wall look, in hindsight, like exactly the right strategy. No committee vote, no signed agreement, and no threat and fine from the league office produced that wall. It came from a roster that had decided, one guarded answer at a time, that the press was never going to tell their story the way they wanted it told, and that winning was a better use of their energy than trying to change anyone's mind about who they were. Detroit left that decision unchanged through 2 championships, and history has largely judged the strategy by the banners rather than the box scores of quotes the team refused to give.